Part 65 of the Chronicles of Crime, Part 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 65. Mary Bateman, commonly called the Yorkshire Witch, executed for murder. Part 2. The jury, after conferring for a moment, found the prisoner guilty, and the judge proceeded to pass sentence of death upon her, in nearly the following words: Mary Bateman, you have been convicted of wilful murder by a jury, who, after having examined your case with caution, have, constrained by the force of evidence, pronounced you guilty, and it only remains for me to fulfil my painful duty by passing upon you the awful sentence of the law. After you have been so long in the situation in which you now stand, and harassed as your mind must be by the long detail of your crimes, and by listening to the sufferings you have occasioned, I do not wish to add to your distress by saying more than my duty renders necessary. Of your guilt there cannot remain a particle of doubt in the breast of any one who has heard your case. You entered into a long and premeditated system of fraud, which you carried on for a length of time, which is most astonishing, and by means which one would have supposed could not, in this age and nation, have been practised with success. To prevent a discovery of your complicated fraud, and the punishment which must have resulted therefrom, you deliberately contrived the death of the persons you had so grossly injured, and that by means of poison, a mode of destruction against which there is no sure protection. But your guilty design was not fully accomplished, and after so extraordinary a lapse of time, you are reserved as a signal example of the justice of that mysterious providence, which sooner or later overtakes guilt like yours. And at the very time when you were apprehended, there is the greatest reason to suppose that if your surviving victim had met you alone, as you wished him to do, you would have administered to him a more deadly dose, which would have completed the diabolical project you had long before formed, but which at that time only partially succeeded, for upon your person at that moment was found a phial containing a most deadly poison. For crimes like yours, in this world the gates of mercy are closed. You afforded your victim no time for preparation, but the law, while it dooms you to death, has, in its mercy, afforded you time for repentance, and the assistance of pious and devout men, whose admonitions and prayers and counsels may assist to prepare you for another world, where even your crimes, if sincerely repented of, may find mercy. The sentence of the law is, and the court doth award it, that you be taken to the place from whence you came, and from thence on Monday next to the place of execution, there to be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and that your body be given to the surgeons to be dissected and anatomized, and may Almighty God have mercy upon your soul. The prisoner having intimated that she was pregnant, the clerk of the arraigns said, Mary Bateman, what have you to say why immediate execution should not be awarded against you? On which the prisoner pleaded that she was 22 weeks gone with child. On this plea the judge ordered the sheriff to impanel a jury of matrons. This order created a general consternation among the ladies, who hastened to quit the court, to prevent the execution of so painful an office being imposed upon them. His lordship, in consequence, ordered the doors to be closed, and in about half an hour 12 married women were being impanelled, and they were sworn in court, and charged to inquire whether the prisoner was with quick child. The jury of matrons then retired with the prisoner, and on their return into court delivered their verdict, which was, that Mary Bateman was not with quick child. The execution, of course, was not respited, and she was remanded back to prison. During the brief interval between her receiving sentence of death and her execution, the Ordinary, the Reverend George Brown, took great pains to prevail upon her ingenuously to acknowledge and confess her crimes. Though the prisoner behaved with decorum during the few hours that remained of her existence, and readily joined in the customary offices of devotion, no traits of that deep compunction of mind which, for crimes like hers, must be felt where repentance is sincere could be observed, but she maintained her caution and mystery to the last. On the day preceding her execution, she wrote a letter to her husband, in which she enclosed her wedding ring, with a request that it might be given to her daughter. She admitted that she had been guilty of many frauds, but still denied that she had had any intention to produce the death of Mr. or Mrs. Perigo. Upon the Monday morning at 5 o'clock she was called from her cell, to undergo the last sentence of the law. She received the communion with some other prisoners who were about to be executed on the same day, but all attempts to induce her to acknowledge the justice of her sentence, or the crime of which she had been found guilty, proved vain. She maintained the greatest firmness in her demeanour to the last, which was in no wise interrupted even upon her taking leave of her infant child, which lay sleeping in her cell, at the moment of her being called out to the scaffold. Upon the appearance of the convict upon the platform, the deepest silence prevailed among the immense assemblage of persons which had been collected to witness the execution. As a final duty, the Reverend Mr. Brown, immediately before the drop fell, again exhorted the unhappy woman to confession, but her only reply was a repetition of the declaration of her innocence, and the next moment terminated her existence. Her body having remained suspended during the usual time, was cut down, and sent to the General Infirmary at Leeds to be anatomised. Immense crowds of persons assembled to meet the hearse in which it was carried, and so great was the desire of the people to see her remains, that £30 were collected for the use of the infirmary, by the payment of 3d. for each person admitted to the apartment in which they were exposed. A short sketch of the life of this remarkable woman, and a few anecdotes of her proceedings, shall conclude this article. Mary Bateman, it appears, was born of reputable parents at Aisenby, near Thirsk, in the North Riding of Yorkshire, in the year 1768. Her father, whose name was Harker, carrying on business as a small farmer. As early as the age of 5 years, she exhibited much of that sly knavery which subsequently so extraordinarily distinguished her character, and many were the frauds and falsehoods of which she was guilty, and for which she was punished. In the year 1780 she first quitted her father's house to undertake the duties of a servant in Thirsk, but having been guilty of some peccadilloes, she proceeded to York in 1787, but before she had been in that city more than 12 months, she was detected in pilfering some trifling articles of property belonging to her mistress, and was compelled to run off to Leeds, without waiting either for her wages or her clothes. For a considerable time she remained without employment or friends, but at length, upon the recommendation of an acquaintance of her father, she obtained an engagement in the shop of a mantua maker, in whose service she remained for more than 3 years. She then became acquainted with John Bateman, to whom, after a 3 weeks' courtship, she was married in the year 1792. Within 2 months after her marriage she was found to have been guilty of many frauds, and she only escaped prosecution by inducing her husband to move frequently from place to place, so as to escape apprehension; and at length poor Bateman, driven almost wild by the tricks of his wife, entered the supplementary militia. Mrs. Bateman was now entirely thrown upon her own resources, and unable to follow any reputable trade, she, in the year 1799, took up her residence in Marsh Lane, near Timble Bridge, Leeds, and proceeded to deal in fortune-telling and the sale of charms. From a long course of iniquity, carried on chiefly through the medium of the most wily arts, she had acquired a manner and a mode of speech peculiarly adapted to her new profession, and abundance of credulous victims, upon whom she was able to prosecute her schemes, daily presented themselves to her. Her first daring attempt was upon a Mrs. Greenwood, whom she persuaded that her husband was in a situation of the greatest peril, which would be aggravated by the circumstance being mentioned to him, that he was in danger of being accused of a crime, for which he would be instantly sacrificed, and that so relentless and determined were his prosecutors, that unless 4 pieces of gold, 4 pieces of leather, 4 pieces of blotting paper, and 4 brass screws were given to her to screw them down, he would be dead before the morning. Mrs. Greenwood, unfortunately for the trick, was not possessed of even 1 piece of gold, and the proposition of the witch that she should steal what she wanted so startled her, that she had fortitude enough to emancipate herself from the trammels which had been thrown around her. Her next attempt was upon a poor woman named Stead, upon whose jealous fears she worked so far as to obtain from her nearly the whole of her furniture, under pretence of screwing down a woman, with whom she represented that her husband was intimate. Stead was about to enter the army, and Mrs. Bateman next easily found means to persuade him, as she had persuaded his wife, of her powers; and she obtained from him all the little money which he had obtained as his bounty, under the pretence of screwing down his officers to give him promotion. The fascinating and all-powerful Miss Blythe had not yet been discovered, but all her operations were now performed through the medium of a Mrs. Moore, whose existence, it may readily be supposed, was as doubtful as that of her subsequent coadjutor. Terror was the great engine by which this woman carried on her frauds, and as the wife of Stead had still a few articles of furniture and clothing, the last sad wreck of their property, she persuaded her, if something was not done to prevent it, her daughter, who was then only about 8 years of age, would, when she attained the age of 14, become pregnant of an illegitimate child, and that either she would murder herself, or would be murdered by her seducer, to prevent which 17 shillings was to be placed in Mary Bateman's hands. This money she was to hand over to the invisible Mrs. Moore, who was to reduce the coin to a silver charm, which charm was to be worn round the girl's arm till the period of danger was past, but which, when the bubble burst 3 months after, was cut from the child's arm, when, by a strange transmutation of metal, the silver had turned to pewter. In the midst of these scenes of fraud in one party and weakness in the other, a relation of Stead's came over to Leeds in a state of pregnancy, and forsaken by her lover. This young woman was a fine subject for the artful Mary Bateman, who soon learned her misfortune, and undertook, on condition that a guinea was given to her for Mrs. Moore, to make the lover marry her. The money was paid, but no lover appeared. It was then found out that he was too strong for the first charm, and that more money and more screws would be necessary to screw him down to the altar of Hymen. Still he came not, and the girl, finding the money she had fast diminishing, procured a service in a respectable family in Leeds, the master of which being a bachelor, Mary soon contrived to persuade the silly girl that she could by her arts oblige him to marry her. Here a difficulty arose. The unborn child was in the way. But Mary, ever ready to undertake any business, however desperate, engaged to remove the impediment, and for that purpose administered certain medicines to the ill-fated young woman, which produced the desired effect, and abortion ensued. The master, after all, was not to be caught, but the girl's former sweetheart, coming over to Leeds, married her, though she was, at that time, owing, as is supposed, to the medicine given to her by Mary Bateman, in a very emaciated state. In speaking of her connection with this vile woman, she used the following remarkable expression: "Had I never known Mary Bateman, my child would now have been in my arms, and I should have been a healthy woman. But it is in eternity, and I am going after it as fast as time and a ruined constitution can carry me." The unhappy girl died soon after, a melancholy instance of the direful effects which too great credulity and weakness of mind may produce. The artifices and frauds of which she had been hitherto guilty, however, shrink into comparative obscurity when opposed with the offences which Mrs. Bateman subsequently committed. The case of the unhappy Mrs. Perigo has already been mentioned, and its circumstances detailed, but there is too much reason to believe that she was concerned in producing the death of 3 persons, a crime of still greater and more cold-blooded cruelty. The Misses Kitchen were Quaker ladies, who carried on the business of linen drapers near St. Peter's Square, Leeds, and Mrs. Bateman, by representations of her skill in divination and reading the stars, managed so far to ingratiate herself into their good graces as to become their confidant and most intimate adviser. She attended their shop, was a constant visitor at their house, and her interference extended even to the domestic concerns of the family. In the month of September 1803, the younger Miss Kitchen was attacked with a severe and painful illness, and Bateman, possessing the full confidence of the family, procured medicines from a person whom she described as a country doctor, but instead of their producing any improvement in the condition of the unhappy patient, in less than a week she died. Her mother arrived from Wakefield, where she lived, in time only to receive the last breath of her daughter. But in 2 days she, as well as the surviving sister, died, and they were all 3 placed in the same grave. Throughout the whole of these distressing illnesses, Mary Bateman was the sole attendant upon the unhappy women, and after their death she took upon herself the task of rendering them those last melancholy offices which are usually the duty of the near relations of the deceased. No person was permitted by her to enter the house, under pretence that the deceased persons had been affected by the plague, except those whose presence was rendered necessary in order to the performance of the rites of sepulture, and for many weeks the neighbourhood was shunned, lest the supposed infection might spread. Mrs. Bateman, however, in the midst of all, exhibited the most praiseworthy and disinterested affection for the poor ladies, and in the face of all danger hesitated not to minister to their wants, and even after death to take those precautions in fumigating the house which were supposed to be necessary. She prepared their meals, and by her hands alone were the medicines administered, which she professed to have been prescribed. Several months had elapsed before any inquiries were made as to the condition in which the deceased persons had died, and then some of their creditors, having determined to ascertain what property they had left behind them, entered the house. To their surprise they discovered that of the furniture and stock of which the deceased had been known to be possessed, scarce a vestige remained, and the discovery of some articles of property in the house of Bateman, which were known to have belonged to the deceased ladies, but which the former declared had been given to her by them, afforded grounds for a well-founded suspicion that poison was the plague of which they had died, although under the circumstances of the case, and after the lapse of so long a time, evidence could not be obtained which could be deemed conclusive upon the subject. The determined cruelty exercised in the case of the Perigos appeared to sanction the suspicions which were entertained, and after conviction Mrs. Bateman was minutely questioned upon the subject, but all efforts to induce a confession of this crime, or of that which she was found guilty, proved unavailing. It would be useless to follow this wretched woman through the subsequent scenes of her miserable life. Fraud and deceit were the only means by which she was able to carry on the war, and numerous were the impudent and heartless schemes which she put into operation to dupe the unhappy objects of her attacks. Her character was such as to prevent her long pursuing her occupation in one position, and she was repeatedly compelled to change her abode, until she at length took up her residence in Black Dog Lane, where she was apprehended. Her husband at this time had returned from the militia several years, and although he followed the trade to which he had been brought up, there can be little doubt that he shared the proceeds of his wife's villainies. Mary Bateman was neat in her person and dress, and though there was nothing ingenuous in her countenance, it had an air of placidity and composure not ill adapted to make a favourable impression on those who visited her. Her manner of address was soft and insinuating, with the affectation of sanctity. In her domestic arrangements she was regular, and was mistress of such qualifications in housewifery as, with an honest heart, would have enabled her to fill her station with respectability and usefulness. End of Part 65.